That bridge is an unauthorized, aesthetically displeasing eyesore, and I will see it torn down, Mr. Sterling, even if I have to pay for the bulldozer myself. The voice, a grating mix of saccharine condescension and rusted-out vocal cords, belonged to Karen Miller, president, chairwoman, and self-appointed supreme dictator of the Whispering Pines Estates Homeowners Association. She stood on my lawn, a plus-size woman poured into a lurid pink tracksuit that strained at every seam, her fists planted on her ample hips. Behind her, idling with a guttural rumble that vibrated through the soles of my boots, was a Cat D6 bulldozer, its massive blade gleaming with malicious promise. Its operator, a lanky man in a stained flannel shirt, looked profoundly uncomfortable, his eyes darting between me, Heron, and the beautiful covered bridge that spanned the creek at the edge of my property. My bridge. The one I had spent the last 6 months building with my own 2 hands. The morning had started with the scent of coffee and pine, the quiet hum of a life I'd fought for, both overseas and here at home. Now it smelled of diesel fumes and impending warfare. My wife, Sarah, was watching from the window of our living room, her face a pale mask of worry. I gave her a small, hopefully reassuring nod before turning my full attention back to the suburban warlord desecrating my zoysia grass. "Karen," I said, my voice deliberately low and calm, a trick I'd mastered in places far more dangerous than a planned community in upstate New York. "You are trespassing. That bulldozer is trespassing. You have 10 seconds to get your machine and yourself off my property before I call the sheriff and file charges." Her laugh was a harsh barking sound. "Oh, don't you threaten me, you renter." She spat the word like it was a disease. It was her favorite misconception, one she clung to despite all evidence. "People like you don't own. You just drift through. This is a community of owners with standards. Your monstrosity violates Section 7, subsection B, paragraph 4 of the covenants. All exterior structures must be approved by the Architectural Review Committee. And I am the committee." Her chest puffed out, the pink polyester shining in the morning sun. "You never submitted a plan. Therefore, the structure is illegal. Therefore, it's coming down." The bulldozer's engine revved, a mechanical growl backing up her threat. The sound was a physical blow. I felt a cold, familiar rage begin to uncoil in my gut, the kind of anger that had kept me alive in the dust and chaos of Helmand Province. But I wasn't a 22-year-old Marine anymore. I was a 40-year-old man standing on land I had paid for with blood, sweat, and a VA loan. I took a deep breath, channeling the fury into icy resolve. "First," I said, taking a deliberate step forward, planting my feet firmly, "I'm not a renter. You've seen the deed. You've seen the property tax records I sent you last month. My name is on them. Jack Sterling, owner." I let that hang in the air. "Second, this part of my property," I gestured with my arm, tracing a line from an old oak to a granite boulder, "is not, nor has it ever been, part of the Whispering Pines HOA. My 5 acres were carved out of the original parcel before your developer ever broke ground. I have the survey, the title insurance, and a very clear map. You have jurisdiction up to the creek, not across it." Her face, already flushed, deepened to a shade of magenta that clashed horribly with her tracksuit. "Lies! Paperwork tricks! The spirit of the law." "The letter of the law is what matters, Karen," I interrupted, my voice hardening. "And the letter says you're trespassing. Now, for the final time, get off my land." She stared at me, her small eyes glittering with a special kind of suburban malice. She saw my calm as weakness, a fatal error on her part. "Tear it down," she shrieked at the bulldozer operator, pointing a trembling, sausage-like finger at my bridge. "Tear that ugly thing down right now." The operator flinched and looked at me, his eyes wide with a plea for sanity. I just shook my head slowly. I pulled my phone from my pocket, my thumb already hovering over the 911 contact. The operator, seeing the phone, put the machine in neutral and held up his hands. "Ma'am, I can't. Not without a court order or something. He says it's his property. I could lose my license." Karen spun on him, her face contorted. "I am giving you an order. I am the HOA, a president. I am indemnifying you." The man just shook his head, shutting down the engine. The sudden silence was more profound than the noise. It was filled with the singing of birds, the rustle of leaves, and Karen's labored, furious breathing. She turned back to me, her eyes narrowing to slits. This isn't over, Sterling. You have no idea the power I wield in this community. I will bury you in fines. I will put a lien on your house. I will make your life a living hell until you beg me to tear that bridge down. It was a declaration of war. And in that moment, standing on my own land, defending a structure I built out of love, I knew I would not just fight, I would win. This is my life now, and if you've ever had a run-in with a power-mad HOA board, you know exactly what I'm talking about. It's a special kind of crazy. So go ahead and hit that subscribe button because you're going to want to see how this plays out. And in the comments below, tell me where you're watching from and share your own HOA nightmare story. We're all in this together. Now, let me tell you why that bridge meant so much and why Karen's little stunt was not just an attack on my property, but on my family. The story of the bridge, like most important things in my life, begins with Sarah. We met after my last tour, a whirlwind of unexpected grace in a life that had been defined by rigid structure and visceral chaos. She was a landscape architect, a woman who saw the world in terms of potential and beauty. She saw past the scars, both visible and invisible, and helped me build a life outside the military. We bought this land, 5 acres of woods and meadow with a winding creek because it was quiet. It was a place to heal. 2 years ago, that quiet was shattered. A patch of black ice, a distracted driver, and Sarah's world was irrevocably altered. A crushed vertebra, a traumatic brain injury, and months of grueling rehabilitation. She survived, my tough, incredible Sarah, but the easy mobility she once took for granted was gone. She walked now with a pronounced limp, her balance precarious, and on bad days, she relied on a walker or a wheelchair. Our beautiful, rugged property had suddenly become a landscape of obstacles. The back half of our land, across the creek, was her favorite part. It opened into a small, sun-dappled meadow with a natural pond where dragonflies danced in the summer. But the only way to get there was to scramble down a steep, muddy bank and cross on a series of slippery, moss-covered stones. It was now as inaccessible to her as the moon. Seeing the longing in her eyes as she stared at the meadow from our deck became a constant dull ache in my chest. So I decided to build a bridge. Not just any bridge, a masterpiece. I was a combat engineer in the Marines. We built bridges under fire, with whatever materials we could scrounge. Building one in peace with time and good timber was a luxury. I spent months on the design. It had to be wide enough for her wheelchair, with a gentle, almost imperceptible slope. It needed a solid, non-slip floor and high, sturdy railings. And because this was for Sarah, it had to be beautiful. I chose a classic covered bridge design, a miniature version of the iconic structures of New England. It would protect her from the sun and rain, a little sanctuary on the journey. I submitted the plans to the town of Northwood, not the Whispering Pines HOA. The town planning office was a dusty, quiet place run by a woman named Carol, who had been there for 30 years. She examined my blueprints, cross-referenced them with the official county survey maps, and confirmed my property line. "Yep," she'd said, stamping the papers with a satisfying thud. "The creek is the boundary. Your 5 acres are your own little kingdom. As long as you're not impeding the waterway, and this design certainly doesn't, you're good to go. The permit is approved." The build was my therapy. I sourced local hemlock and cedar, learning the art of mortise and tenon joinery. I poured the concrete footings deep and strong, anchoring them to the bedrock beneath the creek bank. Every cut, every joint, every peg was an act of devotion. Neighbors from the HOA would sometimes wander by, watching from their side of the creek. Most were friendly, admiring the craftsmanship. A few, the ones in Karen's inner circle, would just stare with a pinched, sour expression before turning away. I didn't care. I was in my element. The day it was finished, I guided Sarah, who was using her walker, onto the smooth planks. She stopped in the middle, under the shelter of the roof, and ran her hand along the railing. The sun filtered through the open sides, casting patterns on the floor. She looked across to the meadow, then back at me, her eyes shining with tears. You built me a path back to my favorite place, she whispered. That was my reward. That was everything. The bridge became her lifeline. She'd go out there every morning, sometimes with a book, sometimes just to sit and watch the deer. It was a symbol of recovery, of our shared future. And Karen Wired Miller saw it as a violation. The first letter arrived a week after the bridge was completed. A crisp, cream-colored envelope with the Whispering Pines Estates logo embossed in gold. It was a formal notice of violation, citing the infamous Section 7. It demanded the unapproved structure be removed within 30 days, or I would face a fine of $100 per day. I responded with a polite, firm letter, enclosing a copy of my town-issued permit and the relevant section of my property survey. I explained as if to a child that the bridge was not on HOA land and therefore not subject to its covenants. I thought that would be the end of it. I was wrong. It was just the opening salvo in what was to become the Great Bridge War. Karen's response was another letter, this one less formal and more hysterical. She rejected my so-called permits and accused me of flagrant disregard for community harmony. The fines, she informed me, were now retroactive to the first day of construction. The absurdity was breathtaking. It was then I discovered the real source of her ire, the detail that made this whole situation a tinderbox waiting for a spark. A few months prior, the HOA, under Karen's leadership, had installed a new, expensive automated gate at the far end of their development. It was an emergency exit leading out onto a rough, unpaved track. That track, an old logging road, cut directly across the back corner of my property and connected to the main road about a mile down. I had granted the HOA a limited, emergency use only easement for that road when I bought the place. A gesture of goodwill. The only way for an emergency vehicle to get from their new gate to that road was to cross the creek, right where my bridge now stood. Karen hadn't just seen an unapproved structure. She'd seen an obstacle to her grand, half-baked emergency plan. And she was not a woman who tolerated obstacles. The failure of her bulldozer gambit did not, as a sane person might expect, chasten Karen. It radicalized her. The day after the standoff, the official-looking cream envelopes began arriving with the grim regularity of mortar fire. The first contained a bill for $3,000, representing 30 days of fines for the bridge's existence. The second, arriving 2 days later, added a new charge, impeding HOA functions, for another $500. A third letter, hand-delivered by a nervous-looking board member who practically threw it on my porch and ran, informed me that I was being fined for the unauthorized presence of heavy machinery on my own property, referring, of course, to the bulldozer she had hired. The hypocrisy was so potent, it almost had a physical smell. I knew this was a war of attrition. Karen's strategy was clear: overwhelm, intimidate, and bankrupt. She was counting on me being a typical homeowner who would eventually fold under the pressure of mounting fines and legal threats. She didn't know that my entire adult life had been training for this. The Marine Corps teaches you many things, but chief among them is how to handle a relentless, often illogical enemy. You don't meet chaos with more case. You meet it with process. You meet it with documentation. You meet it with overwhelming, meticulously organized facts. So I went to the store and bought a 3-inch 3-ring binder. It was a heavy-duty one, black and imposing. On the spine, I affixed a label in crisp block letters, HOA K. Miller. This binder became my weapon system. Every letter from Karen was slipped into a clear plastic sleeve. My typed formal responses were placed right behind them. I sent everything via certified mail with return receipt requested, adding the green signature cards to the binder as well. I made a trip to the town hall and got certified copies of my property deed, the full county survey map, my original building permit, and the certificate of completion for the bridge. I 3-hole punched the title insurance policy. The binder grew heavy, thick with the armor of legal truth. I started a spreadsheet, logging every piece of correspondence, every date, every threat, every fine. It was calming, methodical work. It was control. While I was building my fortress of paperwork, Karen was waging a campaign for hearts and minds, or what passed for them in her sphere of influence. She held a special informational coffee clatch on her oversized front porch, the purpose of which, I later learned from a sympathetic neighbor, was to paint me as a dangerous outsider. She told them I was a transient military type with no respect for the community. She claimed my bridge was structurally unsound and would collapse, posing a danger to the neighborhood children who might wander onto my property, which was, I noted with irony, fenced and clearly marked. She spun a tale of my aggressive and threatening behavior during the bulldozer incident, conveniently omitting the part where she was ordering the destruction of my property. The narrative was taking hold among her loyalists. I started getting glares when I drove through the neighborhood. One of her cronies, a man named Bob, who washed his Lexus every single day, made a point of turning his back on me when I waved. It was petty, juvenile, and deeply annoying. But one evening, as Sarah and I were eating dinner, there was a tentative knock on the door. It was Margaret, a small, bird-like woman in her 70s who lived 2 houses down from the HOA's entrance. She was clutching a familiar cream-colored envelope in her trembling hands. "I'm so sorry to bother you, Mr. Sterling," she whispered, her eyes darting around as if Karen might pop out of the azalea bushes. "But I heard you were fighting them." I invited her in, and Sarah made her a cup of tea, and Margaret's story tumbled out. She had received a violation notice. Her crime? A collection of cheerful, hand-painted garden gnomes that peeked out from her rose bushes. According to Karen's edict, they were tacky and violated the aesthetic code. Margaret had been fined $25 per gnome per day. There were 7 gnomes. "They were a gift from my grandchildren," she said, her voice thick with emotion. "I've had them for years." She never said anything before. This was it. This was the key. It wasn't just about me or my bridge. It was about a pattern of capricious, vindictive control. Karen wasn't enforcing rules. She was exercising power for its own sake. I told Margaret not to pay the fine. I advised her to write a letter, disputing it, and to send it by certified mail. I walked her through the process, the same one I was following. I saw a flicker of defiance in her eyes, the first spark of resistance. "Thank you," she said, standing to leave. "You know, my late husband, Arthur, he was in the Navy. He always said, 'You don't let a bully win the day just by being the loudest one on the deck.'" As I closed the door behind her, I felt a shift. This wasn't just my fight anymore. Karen thought she was isolating me. Instead, she was creating an insurgency. My binder was no longer just about defending my bridge. It was becoming a chronicle of a community's abuse, a dossier that would, in time, become the instrument of Karen Miller's spectacular self-destruction. I added a new section to the binder that night, labeled Collateral Damage and Potential Allies. Margaret's gnome story was the first entry. I had a feeling it wouldn't be the last. The fines were now approaching 5 figures. The certified letters were flying back and forth like digital arrows in an ancient battle. It was time to escalate my own game. The total on the invoice was $11,400. It was printed on Karen's signature cream-colored paper, detailing a litany of fabricated offenses. Daily fines for the bridge, penalties for my uncooperative attitude, and a new creative charge, environmental damage, for the supposed disruption to the creek bed from my bridge's footings, which were, of course, inspected and approved by the town's conservation agent. The letter ended with a bold, underlined threat. If the full amount was not paid within 10 business days, the Whispering Pines Estates HOA would place a lien on my property. This was the nuclear option. A lien could complicate my mortgage, wreck my credit, and make it impossible to sell. It was a legal cudgel designed to bring me to my knees. It was also the precise moment I knew I needed professional help. My binder was a powerful defensive weapon, but I was an engineer, not a lawyer. This was no longer a battle of letters. It was a flanking maneuver on the legal field, and I was out of my depth. I wasn't going to hire just any local attorney who handled slip and falls and DUIs. I needed a specialist. I needed a shark. My search led me to a firm in the city, an hour's drive away. The firm was called Valor Legal Group. The name caught my eye first. Their website was all business, sleek, professional, and populated with photos of sharp-looking lawyers who had the unmistakable bearing of former military officers. Their specialty, property law, contract disputes, and most promisingly, litigation against mismanaged homeowner associations. I made the call, The woman who answered the phone, a paralegal with a voice that was both warm and incredibly efficient, listened to my brief summary without interruption. "Hold, please," she said. Less than a minute later, a new voice came on the line. "This is Amelia Davis. Tell me about the bridge, Mr. Sterling." And so I did. I told her everything. The bulldozer, the property lines, the permits, the finades, the lien threat, Karen's personal vendetta, Margaret and her gnomes. I spoke for 15 uninterrupted minutes. When I was done, there was a long pause on the other end of the line. For a heart-stopping second, I thought she was going to tell me I was sunk. "Mr. Sterling," she finally said, her voice a low, controlled instrument that radiated competence. "I believe the technical legal term for what you're describing is a target-rich environment. Can you be in my office tomorrow at 900 and bring your binder?" The next morning, I walked into an office that was the polar opposite of the dusty town hall. It was all glass and steel and muted tones, with a view of the city skyline. Amelia Davis was even more impressive in person. She was a tall, African-American woman in her late 30s, dressed in a perfectly tailored gray suit. She had a handshake like a vice, and eyes that seemed to see right through you. She was, as the firm's website had hinted, a former JAG officer, an Army lawyer. "Marines," she said with a wry smile as she took my heavy binder. "You guys always have the best paperwork." She cleared the massive mahogany desk and opened the binder. For the next hour, she said almost nothing. She just read. She turned the pages with a lawyer's precision, her eyes scanning, absorbing. She read my letters. She read Karen's increasingly unhinged replies. She examined the certified mail receipts, the photos of the bridge, the survey map, the deed. I watched her expression, looking for tells. Her face was mostly a mask of professional concentration, but I saw a flicker of a smile when she read the fine for the bulldozer. I saw her eyebrows raise when she got to the part about the emergency exit easement. Finally, she closed the binder. The sound echoed in the quiet office like a gavel. "Okay," she said, leaning back in her chair and steepling her fingers. "Here's where we are. On a scale of 1 to 10, with 10 being they have you dead to rights, Karen Miller's case against you is a -4. I felt a wave of relief so profound it almost made me dizzy. "Her entire legal theory," Ms. Davis continued, "is based on the premise that your property is under her jurisdiction. It is not. That is not a matter of opinion. It is a matter of recorded legal fact. Every action she has taken based on that false premise, the fines, the threats, the attempt to hire a bulldozer, is not just wrong, it's legally actionable. It's called tortious interference, and it's expensive." She leaned forward, her voice dropping. "The lien is an empty threat. To place a lien, they have to go to court and prove a valid debt. We have this," she patted my binder, "which proves the debt is fraudulent. A judge would laugh her out of the courtroom and likely sanction her for filing a frivolous claim." "So what do we do?" I asked. "We could sue her into oblivion right now," she said, a dangerous glint in her eye. "But I have a better idea, a more elegant one. Karen Miller is a classic bully, and bullies get their power from the belief that they are untouchable. Our goal is not just to make her back off you. Our goal is to dismantle her entire power structure, using her own rules and her own overreach against her. We are going to let her walk right into a trap she doesn't even see." The strategy she laid out was brilliant in its simplicity. First, we would formally dispute the entire debt. Ms. Davis would draft a letter so legally intimidating, so laden with case law and statutory citations, that it would give the HOA's own lawyer, assuming they had a competent one, a migraine. The letter would demand they cease and desist all collection activities and retract the threat of a lien. Second, we would continue to pay my regular HOA dues for the small corner of my property that did technically fall under their purview, a 50-square-foot patch of lawn near the road. This was crucial. It showed we were acting in good faith, separating the legitimate fees from the fraudulent ones. Third, and most importantly, we would turn our attention to the emergency exit. "This is the fulcrum, Jack," she said, tapping the survey map. "This little gate to nowhere. She thinks it's her path to relevance. We're going to make it her highway to hell." She explained that by threatening my bridge, Karen was potentially creating a massive liability for the entire community. If there were ever a real emergency, a fire and medical crisis, and access was blocked because of this dispute, the HOA could be sued for negligence. "We're not going to threaten her with that," Ms. Davis said with a predatory smile. "We're going to let the fire chief do it for us." I left her office feeling 10 feet tall. The weight of the world was off my shoulders, replaced by the thrilling, cold clarity of a well-planned mission. I was no longer just defending. I was on the attack. The game had changed. I had my binder, and now I had my shark. Karen Miller had no idea what was coming. The first move in Ms. Davis's plan was a masterpiece of legal psychological warfare. The letter she drafted was 6 pages long, single-spaced, and so dense with legal jargon, citations of New York property law, and references to previous case precedents that it felt heavy in my hand. It was addressed not just to Karen, but to every single member of the Whispering Pines HOA Board of Directors, sent to their individual homes via certified mail. This was a critical detail. It prevented Karen from simply intercepting it and controlling the narrative. Now every board member knew that they knew. The letter systematically dismantled every claim Karen had made. It cited the county recorder's office, document number by document number, to establish my property lines. It included a notarized affidavit from Carol, the town planning clerk, confirming the legality of my permits. It referenced specific statutes on frivolous litigation and attorney's fees, subtly hinting that if this went to court, the board members could be held personally liable for the costs. The final paragraph was the coup de grace. It stated in no uncertain terms that any attempt to file a lien would be met with an immediate countersuit for tortious interference, slander of title, and intentional infliction of emotional distress, for which we would be seeking punitive damages to the fullest extent of the law. A copy of the letter, Ms. Davis informed me, was also sent to the HOA's insurance carrier. The effect was immediate and seismic. My phone rang 2 days later. It was Bob, the Lexus washing crony from the board. His tone was no longer dismissive, it was panicked. "Jack, Bob from the board here. Listen, we got this letter from your lawyer. I think there's been a big misunderstanding. Karen told us, well, she didn't exactly give us the full picture." I just listened. "Look," he stammered, "we're having an emergency board meeting tonight. I just want you to know, some of us, we're not on board with this lien business. This has gone too far. The cracks were appearing in Karen's empire, but a legal letter, no matter how potent, wasn't enough. The second phase of the plan was about people. As Ms. Davis had said, we needed to dismantle Karen's power structure, and that structure was built on the fear and apathy of our neighbors. It was time to turn apathy into action. Sarah, who had been watching this whole affair with a quiet, steely anger of her own, had an idea. "We can't fight her by being like her," she said one evening. "We have to build, not just tear down. We need to build a community." Her plan was simple, a neighborhood barbecue. We would host it in our backyard, right by the entrance to the infamous bridge. We wouldn't make it an anti-Karen rally. We'd just invite everyone on our street, extending the invitation to the whole of Whispering Pines. The flyer Sarah designed was beautiful, featuring a drawing of the bridge and the words, "Come see what the fuss is all about. Bridgeside BBQ at the Sterlings." The response was tentative at first, then overwhelming. People were curious. They had heard the whispers, seen the letters, felt the tension. They wanted to see the bridge and meet the man who was at the center of the storm. The day of the barbecue was perfect, a warm Saturday in late summer. I manned the grill, flipping burgers and hot dogs. Sarah, a gracious and welcoming host, moved among the guests, her limp barely noticeable, her smile radiant. People came. Timidly at first, in small groups, they walked down our driveway. They saw the bridge not as an aesthetically displeasing eyesore, but as a beautiful, handcrafted structure. They saw Sarah use it to easily get a drink to a guest sitting on the other side of the creek, and the purpose of it clicked in a way no explanation could have achieved. Margaret was there, proudly holding a plate of her famous lemon bars. She'd brought one of her gnomes with her, a cheerful little fellow with a fishing rod, and placed it defiantly on the potluck table. She introduced me to others who had their own stories. A young couple, the Garcias, had been fined, because their toddler's plastic slide was the wrong shade of primary green. A retired Air Force colonel was in a months-long battle over the flagpole he had installed, which Karen deemed jingoistic. The most important guest, however, arrived midway through the afternoon. He was a quiet, meticulous man in his late 60s named Arthur Henderson. Mr. Henderson was a retired forensic accountant. He had lived in Whispering Pines for 20 years and had, until now, kept to himself. He approached me while I was at the grill. "Mr. Sterling," he said, his voice dry and precise, "I've been observing your situation. I have also been observing the HOA's quarterly financial statements for some time. There are discrepancies." He explained that the budget seemed bloated. There were huge line items for consulting fees and administrative expenses that were vague and unexplained. The emergency gate, he said, had cost nearly double the initial estimate, and the contractor was a company owned by Karen's brother-in-law. "She's running it like a personal fiefdom," Mr. Henderson concluded, adjusting his glasses. "And I suspect the books are a mess if one were to, say, formally request a full independent audit, as the bylaws allow with the signature of 10% of homeowners. I imagine it would be quite illuminating." I looked around my backyard. It was full of people laughing, talking, sharing food. They were no longer isolated individuals, afraid of a cream-colored envelope. They were neighbors. They were a community. They were talking to the Garcias about their slide, to the colonel about his flagpole, to Margaret about her gnomes. They were connecting the dots. Before Mr. Henderson left, he handed me a clipboard. "I took the liberty of drafting a petition," he said with a small, prim smile. "For the audit, I believe you'll find it easy to gather the requisite signatures today." By the end of the day, the clipboard was full. We had more than double the number of signatures needed. The war was no longer being fought just with legal letters. We now had a popular uprising. The barbecue was a turning point. It transformed me from the neighborhood pariah into the reluctant leader of a resistance movement. Karen had tried to make me an outsider, but in doing so, she had united everyone else against her. Her power was based on keeping people divided and afraid. We were now united and angry, and we had an accountant. With the community mobilized and Ms. Davis holding the legal line, it was time to execute the final decisive phase of the operation. The trap. The entire strategy hinged on the emergency exit gate in the bridge. Karen saw the bridge as my weakness. Ms. Davis saw it as Karen's Achilles heel. The plan was to force an official, undeniable verdict on the bridge's status, not from the HOA, but from a higher authority that Karen couldn't ignore or bully. That authority was the Northwood Fire Department. Ms. Davis drafted another letter, but this one didn't go to Karen. It went to Fire Chief Michael O'Connell, a man with a reputation for being thorough, by the book, and having zero tolerance for bureaucratic nonsense. The letter was a masterpiece of feigned innocence. "On behalf of my client, Mr. Jack Sterling, we are writing to seek clarification regarding emergency vehicle access for the Whispering Pines estates. It has come to our attention that the HOA has designated a new emergency egress point at the rear of the development. As the access route from this gate appears to cross our client's private property and utilize a bridge he recently constructed, we wish to ensure that all structures and pathways are fully compliant with Northwood's emergency response codes. We would be grateful for an official inspection and assessment at your earliest convenience to ensure the safety of all residents." The letter was a work of art. It didn't accuse or complain. It positioned me as a concerned, responsible citizen seeking to cooperate with public safety officials. It also, without saying so directly, dropped a massive problem squarely on the fire chief's desk. If the HOA's designated emergency route was indeed dependent on my private, unvetted bridge, that was a major issue for the town's emergency planning. 2 days later, I received a call from Chief O'Connell himself. His voice was pure gravel, the sound of a man who had seen too many fires and attended too many town meetings. "Mr. Sterling, Chief O'Connell, I got a letter from your lawyer. What in the hell is going on over there at Whispering Pines?" I explained the situation calmly and factually, sticking to property lines, permits, and the HOA's threats. I emailed him the survey map, the town permit for the bridge, and a photo of the finished structure. There was a long silence on his end. "Let me get this straight," he finally said. The HOA wants to tear down the only bridge that leads to their designated emergency exit? That's the gist of it, Chief. I could almost hear him shaking his head through the phone. Jesus, Mary, and Joseph. These HOA people are a different breed. All right, son, I'm scheduling a full site inspection and vehicle access test. Thursday, 1000 hours. I want you there. I want your lawyer there. And I am personally inviting President Miller and her board. This is going to get sorted out once and for all. Now it was my turn to set the final piece of the trap. I sent a certified letter to Karen and the board. Following up on our ongoing correspondence regarding the bridge structure, please be advised that, in the interest of community safety, I have requested and scheduled an official inspection and access test with the Northwood Fire Department. The inspection, to be conducted by Chief O'Connell, will take place this Thursday at 10 a.m. at the bridge site. Your presence is requested to review the findings regarding the emergency egress route. I was baiting her. The tone was cooperative, almost submissive. It was designed to appeal to her ego, to make her believe this was a meeting where I would be the one getting dressed down by an official. She would see it as a public forum to have her authority validated by the fire chief. She would never imagine the chief was already on my side. She would walk into it with all the misplaced confidence of a coyote chasing a roadrunner off a cliff. Thursday morning dawned bright and clear. The air was crisp with the promise of autumn. At 9:45 a.m., Miss Davis pulled up in her immaculate black sedan, looking every inch the legal powerhouse. We stood by the bridge, my binder resting on the railing like a silent sentinel. At precisely 10 a.m., a procession of official vehicles arrived. First, Chief O'Connell's Red Command SUV, then a police cruiser, then the town planner, Carol, in her dusty Ford Focus, and then the main event. Ladder 1, a massive gleaming red fire engine, its diesel engine a low thrum of barely contained power. As the officials gathered, Karen's white SUV came screaming down the road, parking haphazardly on the grass. She emerged, flanked by Bob and another board member, a woman who looked like she'd rather be anywhere else. Karen was wearing a navy blue pantsuit, her official business attire, and a smug, triumphant smile. She strode toward Chief O'Connell, her hand outstretched. Chief, thank you so much for coming. I'm Karen Miller, president of the HOA. We are so glad you're here to help us deal with this non-compliant structure. Chief O'Connell, a big man with a weathered face and piercing blue eyes, looked from her to the bridge, then to me. He didn't take her hand. Ma'am, he said, his voice flat, let's see what we've got. He gestured to the fire engine. All right, Jimmy, bring her up, nice and slow. The huge engine lurched forward, crawling down the dirt track toward the creek. It stopped just short of the bridge. The sheer size of it was intimidating. It made the bridge look delicate, almost fragile. I could see Karen's smile widen. This was the moment she was waiting for, the moment the chief would declare the bridge inadequate, a toy, and order it removed. The chief, a clipboard in his hand, walked onto the bridge. He stomped his heavy boots on the planks. He ran his hand along the railings, examined the joinery, peered over the side at my concrete footings. He spent a full 5 minutes inspecting my work. I held my breath. I had built it to spec, overbuilt it even, but this was the ultimate test. He walked back off the bridge and came over to me. Mr. Sterling, you were a combat engineer, is that right? Yes, Chief. Marines? Yes, Chief. He nodded, a flicker of a smile on his lips. I can tell. You could park this whole damn truck on this bridge and it wouldn't creak. This is a fine piece of work. He then turned to face Karen, his expression hardening. His voice boomed, carrying across the clearing so everyone could hear. Ma'am, is this gate, he pointed to the HOA's shiny emergency gate, your development's designated and approved emergency exit? Karen puffed up, beaming. Yes, it is, Chief. We had it installed for the safety of our residents. And this road, he gestured down the track, is the designated route? Yes. So, the chief paused, letting the silence hang. He pointed a thick finger at my bridge. Can someone please explain to me why, in God's name, your official plan was to demolish the one and only thing that makes your emergency exit functional? The trap had sprung. The chief's question hung in the air, heavy and sharp as a guillotine blade. All eyes turned to Karen. The smug, triumphant smile had vanished from her face. replaced by a slack-jawed expression of pure, uncomprehending shock. The color drained from her cheeks, leaving her skin a pasty, mottled gray. She opened her mouth, but only a small, squeaking sound came out. She looked like a fish that had just been slapped onto a hot pier. Bob, the Lexus washer, took a half step away from her, a subtle but unmistakable act of self-preservation. The other board member looked at her shoes, wishing the earth would swallow her whole. The silence stretched, becoming more and more damning with every passing second. The only sounds were the birds, the wind in the pines, and the low, idling rumble of the massive fire engine that now seemed to serve as a monument to Karen's catastrophic miscalculation. Chief O'Connell let the silence do its work for a few more moments before he continued, his voice a low, angry growl. Because from where I'm standing, it looks like this HOA board was actively trying to sabotage its own emergency response plan. It looks like you were willing to endanger the lives of every man, woman, and child in this development over what? An aesthetic disagreement? He took a step toward her, and Karen physically flinched. Let me be crystal clear, Ms. Miller. This bridge, he slapped the railing with his hand, making a solid, satisfying thud, is not a non-compliant structure. As of this moment, it is a designated and critical piece of public safety infrastructure for the Whispering Pines community. It is the sole viable access point for emergency vehicles from this egress. Far from being a violation, Mr. Sterling has done this community a service, I might add, for which he has received nothing but harassment. He turned to me. Mr. Sterling, I'm sending you a formal letter of commendation for the quality of your construction and your civic-mindedness in bringing this matter to our attention. Then he turned back to Karen, his eyes like chips of blue ice. And you, Ms. Miller, will be receiving a formal letter of reprimand for obstruction and for creating a public safety hazard. Your emergency plan is contingent on this bridge. You will not touch it. You will not threaten the man who built it. You will not so much as look at it sideways. Am I understood? Karen's face was a crumbling ruin of fury and humiliation. This was not how her public triumph was supposed to go. She was supposed to be the hero, the enforcer of rules. Instead, she had been exposed as a fool, a dangerous, petty tyrant in front of her own board members, the town planner, a police officer, and the one man in the county whose authority she couldn't possibly challenge. Her power, which was built entirely on perception and intimidation, had been shattered in a single public moment. She finally found her voice, but it was a reedy, pathetic thing. But the bylaws, the architectural review. Your bylaws do not supersede town safety codes, state law, or common sense, the chief snapped, cutting her off. Your architectural review committee does not have jurisdiction over my fire engine. This discussion is over. With a final dismissive glare, he turned his back on her and addressed the town planner. Carol, I want a copy of this on file with the planning board. This bridge is now part of the official town emergency map. Let's make sure there's no confusion in the future. He nodded to me and Miss Davis. My thanks to you both. You probably prevented a real tragedy down the line. And with that, he got into his SUV. The fire engine driver gave a short, cheerful blast of the horn, a sound of pure victory, before expertly executing a three-point turn and heading back the way he came. The police officer and Carol followed. Within minutes, the official procession was gone, leaving just us, the board members, in the smoldering wreckage of Karen's authority. Mrs. Davis, who had been watching the entire exchange with the quiet satisfaction of a chess master watching a checkmate unfold, stepped forward. Karen, she said, her voice soft but carrying a lethal edge. I believe this concludes our business regarding the bridge. We will, of course, expect a full and immediate retraction of all fines and a formal apology. My bill for today's services will be sent to the HOA's legal counsel. Karen just stared at her eyes vacant. Then something inside her seemed to snap. Her face contorted into a mask of pure, undiluted rage. You, she shrieked, pointing a trembling finger at me. You think you've won? This isn't over. I will ruin you. You will do nothing, Karen, a new voice said. It was Bob. He had found his spine. You're done. You've embarrassed this community. You have exposed us to massive liability, and you lied to us. We're calling a special meeting." Karen stared at him, aghast. Her most loyal sycophant had turned on her. It was the final fatal blow. Without another word, she spun around, stumbled back to her SUV, and peeled out, spraying gravel and turf in her wake. The battle was over, but I knew the war for the soul of Whispering Pines had just entered its final, decisive stage. The public humiliation was the catalyst, but the real reckoning was yet to come. It would be fought not with bulldozers or fire trucks, but with spreadsheets and bylaws. And I had the perfect man for the job. The fallout from the fire chief's inspection was swift and merciless. News of Karen's public dressing down spread through Whispering Pines like wildfire in a dry field. The story was told and retold at the community mailboxes, on evening walks, and through a flurry of emails and text messages. The narrative had irrevocably shifted. Karen was no longer the powerful, respected president. She was a laughingstock, a cautionary tale of hubris. The fear she had cultivated for years had evaporated, replaced by a heady mixture of anger and empowerment. This was the moment Mr. Henderson, the retired forensic accountant, had been waiting for. The petition for a full financial audit, once a quiet act of rebellion, now became a rallying cry. Mr. Henderson, armed with his clipboard and the community's newfound courage, went door to door. He didn't need to persuade anyone. People were lining up to sign. They didn't just sign, they shared more stories of Karen's financial shenanigans. The Garcias mentioned the landscaping beautification fee that resulted in a single sad-looking shrub being planted near the entrance. The Air Force colonel recalled the exorbitant cost of the new flagpole lighting, which, it turned out, was installed by a company that listed Karen's home address as its place of business. The audit was no longer a request, it was a demand, backed by the signatures of over 40% of the homeowners. Mr. Henderson formally invoked the HOA bylaw that mandated an independent audit. Karen, reeling from her defeat at the bridge, tried to stonewall. She declared the petition invalid, citing a non-existent procedural error. She claimed the board had to vote on it, a delay tactic to buy time. But her power was broken. Bob, now positioning himself as a reformer, joined forces with Mr. Henderson and two other board members. They called her bluff, pointing to the clear language in the covenants. The vote to approve the audit passed 4-1, with Karen as the lone sputtering dissenter. The board hired a respected independent accounting firm from the city, one recommended by Ms. Davis, who had a long list of such professionals for just these occasions. The auditors descended on the HOA's records, which were less a set of books and more a collection of shoeboxes filled with crumpled receipts, cryptic invoices, and cocktail napkins with numbers scrawled on them. While the auditors did their work, Mrs. Davis delivered the final legal blow. She sent a carefully worded letter to the HOA's directors and officers, D&O liability insurance provider. The letter was a dry, factual summary of recent events. It detailed the board's attempt to order the destruction of private property, the subsequent reprimand from the fire chief for obstructing a critical emergency route, and the board's initial resistance to a legally mandated financial audit. The letter didn't need to be inflammatory. The facts themselves were a five-alarm fire. A D&O policy is designed to protect board members from lawsuits arising from their decisions, but it has a crucial exclusion. It does not cover acts of gross negligence or willful misconduct. Attempting to demolish a piece of critical safety infrastructure and mismanaging funds to the point of requiring a forensic audit fell squarely into that category. The insurance company responded immediately. They sent their own team of investigators and lawyers. Suddenly, Karen wasn't just dealing with angry neighbors. She was dealing with humorless insurance adjusters who saw her as a massive financial risk. Her power was a liability they were not willing to underwrite. The results of the audit were presented 3 weeks later at a special community-wide meeting held in the clubhouse. The room was packed, every seat was taken, and people were standing along the walls. The atmosphere was electric, like a courtroom awaiting a verdict. I was there with Sarah, sitting in the back. We weren't the main characters of this chapter. We were just part of the audience, watching the system we had set in motion play out. Mr. Henderson stood at the podium, the lead auditor beside him. He was no longer a quiet, retiring man. He was a warrior in his element, a knight armed with a balance sheet. He walked the community through the findings. It was a bloodbath. There was no evidence of outright embezzlement, no secret offshore account. It was, in some ways, worse. It was a death by 1,000 cuts, a story of staggering incompetence, cronyism, and the use of HOA funds as a personal slush fund. Tens of thousands of dollars had been paid to consultants who turned out to be Karen's friends, hired for vaguely defined projects like community outreach analysis and aesthetic harmony studies. The Emergency Gate project was a masterclass in mismanagement, with cost overruns funneled to her brother-in-law's company for work that was never properly itemized. There were thousands spent on board retreats to nearby spas, lavish dinners expensed as working meetings, and legal fees for a lawyer whose primary job seemed to be writing threatening letters to residents over minor infractions. The biggest gasp came when Mr. Henderson revealed the cost of Karen's personal vendetta against me. The HOA had already spent over $7,000 in legal fees just to draft the threatening letters and consult on the lien she wanted to file. "So let me be clear," Mr. Henderson said, his voice ringing with authority. "Your dues were being used to fund a personal, legally baseless campaign against one of your neighbors. Your money was spent in an attempt to destroy a bridge that the fire chief has now deemed essential for your own safety." The room erupted. The anger that had been simmering for years boiled over. People were shouting, demanding answers. Karen, sitting at the front with the other board members, looked small and deflated. Her face was a mask of sullen denial. She tried to grab the microphone to offer some defense, but Bob physically blocked her. The representative from the insurance company stood up. He announced that, effective immediately, their D&O policy would not be renewed unless there was a complete change in leadership and a full financial overhaul. The board was uninsured, unprotected, and personally exposed. It was over. The final act was a motion from the floor, made by the Air Force colonel, a vote of no confidence in President Karen Miller and the entire board that had enabled her. The vote was a formality. It was nearly unanimous. One by one, the residents of Whispering Pines stood up and raised their hands, a sea of silent, determined rebellion. The power structure had been officially and irrevocably dismantled. The special meeting was a scene of cathartic, chaotic democracy. It wasn't just a meeting, it was a reckoning. After the vote of no confidence passed with an overwhelming majority, the room buzzed with a nervous, excited energy. The king was dead, but who would now rule the kingdom? The bylaws stipulated that in the event of a full board removal, a temporary board must be elected immediately to serve until the next annual election. Nominations were open from the floor. The first name called out was mine. "I nominate Jack Sterling," someone shouted from the back, and a chorus of agreement rippled through the room. I felt Sarah squeeze my hand. All eyes turned to me. I stood up, the silence in the room absolute. For a moment I was tempted. I could take the reins, ensure the reforms were implemented, and make certain a Karen-like figure never rose again. But as I looked at the faces of my neighbors, I realized that wasn't the point. I hadn't fought this war to become the new king. I had fought it so I could live in peace, so I could sit on my bridge with my wife without having to worry about the next threatening letter. "Thank you," I said, my voice carrying in the quiet room. "I am deeply honored by your trust. But this fight was never about me wanting to be in charge. It was about all of us wanting to live in a community that is fair, transparent, and respectful. The best person to lead us isn't the one who won the war, but the one who can win the peace." I then turned and pointed to the man at the podium. "I nominate Arthur Henderson. He has the skills, the integrity, and the meticulous nature this community needs right now to clean up this mess and restore our faith in our own governance." A second wave of applause, even louder this time, filled the room. Mr. Henderson, looking genuinely surprised, blushed to the roots of his neatly combed gray hair. Others were nominated: the colonel for his no-nonsense leadership, one of the Garcias, a sharp young mother and a project manager by trade, and Margaret, the gnome keeper, whose quiet strength had been an inspiration. Margaret politely declined, saying her gnomes required her full attention, but she promised to bake lemon bars for every meeting. A new temporary board was elected, with Mr. Henderson as president and treasurer. Their first act was to unanimously vote to rescind every fine Karen had levied against me, along with a formal, written apology to be entered into the public record. Their second act was to declare a full amnesty on all outstanding aesthetic fines under $500, effectively liberating Margaret's gnomes, the Garcias' slide, and dozens of other minor violations across the neighborhood. A wave of collective relief washed over the room. The final confrontation came not in the public meeting, but just outside it. As Sarah and I were leaving, we saw Karen by her SUV, stuffing a box of her personal effects from the HOA office into the back. She was alone. Her cronies had abandoned her. The aura of power she had once projected was gone, leaving only a bitter, middle-aged woman in a pantsuit that suddenly looked 2 sizes too big. She saw us approaching and her face hardened into its familiar scowl. I expected a final parting volley of insults, a last gasp of her venom. Instead, she just looked at me, her eyes filled with a strange, hollow confusion. "I don't understand," she said, her voice barely a whisper. "I was just trying to maintain standards. I was just following the rules." It was the most honest and the most pathetic thing I had ever heard her say. In her own twisted reality, she was the hero of this story. She genuinely believed her reign of terror was a noble crusade for property values and aesthetic harmony. She was so insulated by her own power, so convinced of her own righteousness, that she couldn't see the damage she had caused or the absurdity of her own position. "The rules have to serve the people, Karen," I said, not with anger, but with a kind of weary pity, not the other way around. "You weren't maintaining standards, you were hurting your neighbors. There's a difference." She just stared at me, the words not computing. She shook her head, slammed the door of her SUV, and drove away, disappearing from the community she had terrorized for so long. We never saw her again. We heard later that she sold her house and moved 2 states away. The new board, led by Mr. Henderson, worked miracles. They untangled the financial mess, renegotiated contracts, and established transparent, common-sense rules. The community began to heal. The vibe in the neighborhood changed. People started talking to each other more. There were more block parties, more kids playing in the streets. The fear was gone, replaced by a sense of shared ownership and mutual respect. My victory wasn't just the letter from the HOA formally apologizing and voiding over $10,000 in fraudulent fines. It wasn't just the commendation from the fire chief, which I framed and hung in my workshop. It wasn't even watching Karen drive away in disgrace. The real victory was quieter. It was the sound of laughter from a neighbor's backyard. It was seeing Margaret's gnomes lined up proudly in her garden again. It was the simple, profound peace of a community that had found its way back to itself. The weeks following Karen's ousting settled into a peaceful, satisfying rhythm. The angry cream-colored envelopes were replaced by friendly waves from neighbors. The rumble of a threatening bulldozer was replaced by the sound of children's laughter from the Garcia's yard, their green slide now a celebrated landmark. The tension that had gripped Whispering Pines for so long had finally broken, leaving behind the clean, fresh air of a post-storm morning. Mr. Henderson and the new board were methodical in their reforms. They held open meetings, published detailed financial reports, and rewrote the most draconian sections of the bylaws. The Architectural Review Committee was disbanded and replaced with a simple set of guidelines based on common sense rather than one person's tyrannical taste. My life returned to the quiet I had so desperately craved. The binder, my weapon of war, was retired to a shelf in my office, a thick black monument to a battle-hard one. My days were once again filled with the simple pleasures of my land, tending the garden, maintaining the trails through the woods, and spending time with Sarah. But the bridge was transformed. It was no longer a symbol of conflict, a fortress to be defended. It had become a landmark, a destination. Neighbors would often wander down on their evening walks to admire it. The colonel would sometimes sit on the bench I'd installed just inside, watching the creek flow by. The Garcia kids, with their parents' permission, would come and sail leaf boats from its railings. It had become a part of the community's fabric, a testament to what we had all been through together. One crisp autumn evening, as the sun began to dip below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and purple, I walked out to the bridge with a small carved piece of cedar and a hammer and nails. Sarah followed me, her steps on the wooden planks steady and sure. I had spent the afternoon in my workshop, carefully carving a name into the wood, It was the final touch, the one that would complete its story. I nailed the plaque to the main crossbeam, right in the center of the archway. Sarah moved closer to read it. The elegant carved letters read, "The Sarah Grace Crossing." She traced the words with her fingers, her touch gentle. She looked at me, her eyes reflecting the warm glow of the setting sun, and her smile was all the thanks I would ever need. "It's perfect," she whispered. We stood there for a long time, leaning against the railing, side by side. We watched the water burble over the stones below, the same stones that had once been an impassable barrier for her. Now she stood here strong and steady, in the heart of the sanctuary I had built for her. This bridge had started as a simple act of love, a personal project to solve a personal problem. It had been twisted by malice and ego into a battlefield. It had been threatened, maligned, and used as a pawn in a power game. It had been the subject of letters, the centerpiece of inspections, and the catalyst for a community rebellion. But in the end, it had endured. It had become something more than just wood and pegs. It was a symbol of resilience, a testament to the fact that a structure built on a foundation of love is far stronger than any built on a foundation of fear. It was a reminder that standing up for what is right, with patience, with facts, and with the support of your community, can defeat even the most entrenched and irrational tyranny. The war with Karen had cost time, energy, and a significant amount of peace of mind. But as I stood on that bridge with my wife, the quiet sounds of the evening settling around us, I knew it had been worth it. We had fought for our home, for our peace, and in the process, helped our neighbors find theirs as well. The bridge was no longer just a path for Sarah to get to her favorite meadow. It was a path for an entire community to get back to a better place. And as the last light of day faded and the first stars began to appear in the twilight sky, I felt a profound sense of victory, a justice that was deeper and more satisfying than any legal ruling. It was the quiet, unshakable justice of a peaceful evening on my own land with the woman I loved on the bridge that love built.